Well, we have made it to conference championship weekend of the college football season. Excited for this weekend, excited for the matchups. Well, I'm excited for all the matchups except one, and we'll talk about it because we kind of have to, because it is conference championship weekend. Big impact on the college football playoff, among other things. So we will talk about that particular game here in a minute. Also, we got some storylines. We've got storylines involving Lane Kiffin and the saga that just keeps on sagaing. I don't know. It's a gift that keeps on giving here around the Christmas season is Lane Kiffin and all of his drama. So we'll talk about a little bit of that here in just a few minutes, as well as some double standards I see with the committee. You know, new edition of the rankings dropped last night, so we're going to talk about those as well. And then, is there a chance? I know I talked about it a few weeks ago. The chance that we see one conference that's left completely out of the playoff. We'll talk about that as well. And also, thing that has to be mentioned, could a Alabama team fall out of the playoff with a loss to Georgia? We will talk about that as well, along with giving our predictions on the conference championship matchups. So, welcome back to another episode of After the Whistle. It's me, Colby Allen. Maybe get tired of hearing my voice from time to time, but, you know, whatever. Deal with it. So, things here this week really have progressed on the Lane Kiffin front. And first off, let's get a couple things out of the way, because I've seen a lot of drama, a lot of back and forth in the college football media space online about, one, you got people criticizing his decision. Obviously, Ole Miss fans are going to criticize Lane Kiffin's decision. Lane Kiffin could have left on good terms, and Ole Miss fans would still hate his guts. Am I wrong? Am I right? Or am I right? Right? Okay. So, you'd still hate his guts if he left in the right context. Okay? The fact that this whole thing, I picture, like, in my mind, a short little video of Lane Kiffin walking down the street, and behind him there's just everything's up in flames behind him. I feel like that's how this whole scenario has been playing out, right, over the last week. Is Lane Kiffin apparently, and this is being reported by multiple sources, so you take it whichever way you want to. You can take it to heart, you can take it as gospel, you can take it whatever, or you can choose not to believe it. It's whatever. And I'm not going to get into the dog thing. Like, I've seen that. That's, to me, I could care less. I mean, I love dogs, don't get me wrong. I own an English Cocker Spaniel Beagle mix named Piper. Love her to death. But I'm not going to get into the dog thing. And if you haven't heard anything about the dog, there's a rumor that, that Lane Kiffin's Labrador, Juice Kiffin, was a photo op prop, that the dog didn't belong to him, that it belongs to someone else in Oxford, and Lane just called and used him when he needed him for photo opportunities or whatever else, trying to get in the good graces of the fans. And there's this big conspiracy out there. Where's the dog now? Where is it? Yada. I'm not going to get into that, because to me, it's not college football news. That's teetering on the line of something else. I'm not going to talk about that. What I will talk about is, I will say, the manner in which this whole situation just blew up, really, is it all started with a meeting between Lane Kiffin and Keith Carter, the athletic director at Ole Miss. And apparently what happened in that meeting was they sat down, two grown adults, sit down, have a conversation. And here's the way that would have played out if I were the athletic director at Ole Miss. And so Lane Kiffin walks in my office. Lane Kiffin says, "Hey, Colby, so here's the thing. I'm thinking about, not thinking. I'm taking the LSU job." Okay. I'd have been like, okay, get out. That's really how it should have gone. But the reports are saying that the conversation led more into a discussion about Lane Kiffin taking the LSU job, but at the same time going to coach Ole Miss in the playoff and see this thing through, so to speak. And here's an analogy on that, and you'll have to excuse the analogy if you find it distasteful or whatever else. This would be the equivalent of you dating someone or being married to someone, excuse me. This would be the equivalent of you being married to someone and asking that person if you could entertain a side piece. I mean, this is, it's not like Lane Kiffin took a job at, someone in a school in another conference. Let's just say Florida State. Let's say Clemson, something like that. I feel like the circumstances are still very similar in that regard, but all in all, it's still somewhat, the principle remains the same. That when you're the coach of a program, you are dedicated, your fans, your boss, which is the athletic director of that school, is 100% counting on you to be dedicated and 100% present in the moment for that football team. The moment that you bring up that you're going somewhere else, okay, that's when the conversation needs to stop. And that's where Keith Carter, I think, drug it out a little too long. And I'm not saying that this isn't Lane Kiffin's fault. I think both parties are to blame with this nasty breakup that they've gone through over the last week, in the sense that Lane Kiffin drug it out, Keith Carter drug it out. The conversation should have been very swift if Lane Kiffin entered Keith Carter's office and said, I'm taking the LSU job, but the conversation should have been cut off right then and said, okay, get out. There's the door. If you're not committed to Ole Miss, you are no longer welcome here, so leave. And I know people are going to listen to my take on that, and they're going to say, well, what about John Summerall? He's the head coach of Tulane. He took the Florida job, and, Florida and Tulane are both agreeing to let him coach through the playoff. That's a different scenario that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, in the sense that this is Tulane and Florida. These are not direct competitors for talent. Tulane doesn't recruit the same players that Florida recruits, and vice versa, nor do they recruit at the same talent level. So, or they're not rivals. They're not in the same conference, etc., and so on, so on and so forth. So the lens you have to look through this through is, this is a direct competitor. This is like in the business world, this would be like the equivalent of you leaving your current job, going and agreeing to go work for a direct competitor, but still trying to work out a 2-week notice at your current job. And they're not going to allow that to happen. If you go, say you work at some department store, say you work at Publix, and you go to work for Kroger, and, they're very similar scopes at what they do, and therefore, you're not going to be allowed to entertain both parties at the same time. And that's the way this kind of works. So like I said, it's like being married and, entertaining a side piece at the same time, or asking permission to entertain the side piece at the same time. That's not going to happen. And when you sign the dotted line on that contract to be the coach at LSU, 7 years, $91 million, when you sign that contract, you are married to that program. I'm surprised, we don't know, nor have we heard really, how LSU thought about this scenario. Or did Lane Kiffin even approach LSU about it, is the big question. Did he go to them and say, hey, I'd really like to continue coaching Ole Miss through the playoff? Was that a discussion that was had with the administration at LSU? And I'm not going to say that I doubt it, but at the same time, it definitely leaves me kind of puzzled to think that. Ultimately, this worked out. People say what they want. People say, oh, Lane did it for himself, and Lane has a press conference that says that he didn't, he told his agent not to mention the money to him, not to talk about the money, the dollar figures. He didn't want to make a decision based off money, all this. You can choose to believe that. You can choose to think it's total BS that he said that to his agent. But regardless, both parties should just move on from it. I mean, really. Ole Miss has announced that Pete Golding will be the head coach of the football program going forward. LSU has Lane Kiffin. Move on with it. Like, the longer we dwell on it, the more of a distraction it becomes. Ole Miss, in case you haven't forgotten, you have a playoff to get ready for. You only have a couple weeks. Those couple weeks are going to fly by with the holidays and everything else. Like, you have to get ready for the playoff. You can't have this as a distraction moving forward. And likewise, Lane Kiffin's got to get on the recruiting trail for LSU. He's got to start his coaching duties there, so you can't allow it to be a distraction really for LSU as well, even though they don't have any, they're going to go to a bowl game, but they don't have those same, I guess, goals and aspirations in front of them this year that Ole Miss does. So I feel like both parties, it would be beneficial to both parties to just move on and, be done with this whole saga, and frankly, the college football fans like me and you, eventually we're going to get tired of hearing about it. Like, how long are we going to milk this story? And I know what you're thinking. Well, you're still talking about it. Well, that's because everybody else is talking about it. But unless anything crazy happens over the next few days, this will be the last I talk about it, because I feel like it's, we're trying to, we're trying to bleed this thing dry for content on other spaces and other podcasts and, with ESPN and all of this. I just feel like we're taking away from, we're taking away from Ole Miss. We are taking away from the phenomenal season that they had to finish 11-1, to win 11 games, go to the playoff, compete for a national championship, potentially going to be hosting a home playoff game in Oxford, which is a really big deal. First time that will ever happen for that fan base. And so I feel like when we dwell too long on issues like we've dwelled on with the Lane Kiffin drama, it takes away from the accomplishments of the team that is Ole Miss. And Ole Miss fans, you can choose to believe what you want about Lane Kiffin. You can say this, you can do that, you can, tweet at him, you can whatever. At the end of the day, he's still the coach at LSU. He's not coming back. He's not doing anything. Will he regret the decision? That answer I feel like could be revealed in due time. But right now he feels where he wants to be, and I feel like I've mentioned a couple times already, I feel like it'd be beneficial for both parties just to move on. So with that, we will move on. So the latest college football playoff rankings, and I have a couple questions as it regards to these. I have some double standards that I'd like to point out that the committee just kind of doesn't quite vibe here. So we're going to go, like I always do, 25-1, and then we're going to talk about a couple things that I'd like to talk about. So James Madison comes in at 25, North Texas at 24, Iowa 23, Georgia Tech 22, Houston 21, Tulane 20, Michigan 19, Arizona 18, Virginia 17, USC 16, Utah 15, Vanderbilt 14, Texas 13, Miami 12, BYU 11, Notre Dame 10, Alabama 9, Oklahoma 8, Texas A&M at 7, Ole Miss at 6, Oregon at 5, Texas Tech at 4, Georgia at 3, Indiana at 2, Ohio State at 1. So double standards. They're kind of this thing that we've been used to seeing with the College Football Playoff Committee since its inception. And every year there's going to be arguments. There's going to be people don't like the ranking, people don't like this, people don't like that. You're not going to make every fan base happy, because there's certain fan bases that feel like, they deserve a spot in the playoff. And those certain fan bases lost to that team lost to a Florida team that won 4 games this year. You can't please everybody, but you can be consistent. That's all we're asking. And, the 14 playoff, it brought its fair share of controversy. You and I both remember the Florida State debacle a few years ago, whether you think that Florida State was snubbed or not. You could make the argument that Florida State and Georgia both were snubbed that particular season. But likewise, don't lose football games. Florida State didn't lose a football game, but on the other side of that coin, Georgia did. So, those have to matter. Consistency has to matter. And all we're asking for is for you to be consistent in your decision making. You can't sit here and you can't tell me one thing and then do the complete opposite in another instance. For example, Texas is ranked ahead of Vanderbilt in these college football rankings. Texas currently sits at 13, Vanderbilt at 14. Both teams appear to be on the outside looking in. Don't feel like either of those teams is going to make it to the playoff. Both of those teams feel like they have a solid case to make it to the playoff, and I feel like you could make the argument that, they could be there. Now, Texas with 3 losses, Vanderbilt with 2. There's other teams in there in that, in the playoff with 2 losses. But the reasoning behind Texas being ahead of Vanderbilt, there's a double standard here where we say Texas is ranked ahead of Vanderbilt because they beat Vanderbilt head-to-head. Okay, so now head-to-heads matter. Okay, so Texas at 9-3 is ranked ahead of a 10-2 Vanderbilt because head-to-heads all of a sudden matter now. Here we are with the next to last edition of the college football playoff rankings, and now all of a sudden head-to-head results matter. Well, head-to-head results haven't mattered ever since the first playoff rankings were released in regards to Notre Dame and Miami, because Miami still sits kind of on the outside looking in here. Notre Dame, a team that they beat, is ranked 2 spots ahead of them at 10. And I know, but here's the dangerous part, is everybody wants to judge teams based on losses. And I understand, Miami losing to a Louisville team, losing to an SMU team, these aren't bad teams per se. It's not like Miami went out and lost to a group of 5 team, or it's not like Miami went out and lost to a, just a terrible football team. They had 2 terrible football games. They did not play Louisville well. They did not play well against SMU. They got 2 losses because of it. Now, when you look at Miami's record against ranked opponents, their record against ranked opponents is better than Notre Dame. Notre Dame 1-2 against ranked opponents. Common opponents, when you look at like NC State, Notre Dame played NC State, Miami played NC State. Notre Dame beat NC State, or Miami beat NC State worse than Notre Dame beat them. There's also 2 other instances in that regard where they played common opponents, and the final results of those football games were better for Miami than they were for Notre Dame. Larger margin of victories. So when we look at this, it's hard for us to think sometimes, and it's hard for us to kind of take the goggles off for a minute and not think that this is not a recency bias and a kind of a brand thing. Whereas we have, Notre Dame made the playoff last year. They made it all the way to the national championship game. And we think that Notre Dame's getting a little bit of the benefit of the doubt this year because of that, because of a recency bias. You could make that argument 100%. Miami has been a team over the last few years, hasn't really pushed for a playoff position. They've had a couple good years where they could make the case. They always find a way to falter it away. Like this year, potentially could end up being in that same category after the losses to Louisville and SMU. But if you're going to tell me that Vanderbilt is ranked behind Texas because of the head-to-head result on the field, but at the same time you're going to have Notre Dame at 10 and Miami at 12, that I have an issue with. And I've had an issue with it ever since the original rankings. You can't do one thing for 2 teams and do the complete opposite on the other side. Texas lost. I mean, you look at who Vanderbilt lost to. Vanderbilt lost to an Alabama team. For example, Vanderbilt lost to an Alabama team. Both of Vanderbilt's losses are against a lot more quality competition, and you look at the loss that Texas had, and you look at, the fact that Vanderbilt's losses are to Texas and Alabama. Whereas Texas has losses to Ohio State, to Georgia, and also, my mind just went blank on me for a second, to Florida, a team that won 4 games this year. Who has the worst loss? Clearly, the worst loss is the Florida loss for Texas. Now, I'm not saying that needs to be the deciding factor, but that needs to be assessed. 9-3, 10-2. It was the same argument that I made a few weeks ago when we talked about Notre Dame and Miami for like the first time, is until Miami slips again, if they have similar records, Miami should be ranked ahead of Notre Dame because of the results on the field. Now, in this regard, Texas 9-3, Vanderbilt 10-2. Vanderbilt should be ranked ahead of Texas. I know Texas fans, we beat Vanderbilt, blah, 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 but you lost to a 4-8 Florida team. The 2 teams Vanderbilt lost to is ranked opponents. You lost to 2 ranked opponents and a unranked opponent that won 4 games this year. So this is the arguments that we have when we expand the playoff to 12 teams. These are the kind of arguments that we have. Is we start arguing the quality of a team's losses. I do not like that argument. This was y'all remember you listened to a podcast last year, an episode that I released on this show where I talked about why I was not for playoff expansion. This was one of those reasons that we are going to stop taking into account a team's wins and we are going to start analyzing losses. To me, that is backdooring your way into you're not backdooring your way into a playoff if you're Texas or Vanderbilt, because I don't think they have any shot of making it. But you're backdooring your way into that playoff discussion because you're like, well, we have quality losses. We lost to Ohio State. We lost to Georgia. We lost to Florida. 2 of those teams are ranked in the top 3 of the country. Yeah, but one of them's unranked and won 4 games. So if you want to play that game and you want to analyze the quality of your losses, Vanderbilt has more quality losses. Vanderbilt's losses are of more quality. The Florida loss should be the separating factor as to why Vanderbilt should be ranked ahead of Texas. End of discussion. Going to move on, get off the soapbox there because I know y'all might not want to hear me continue to talk about it. Some more drama that's around this playoff discussion and everything, and then we'll get into the predictions for this week's conference championship games, is there's been some talk, and we had this same talk at other times last year with SMU in the ACC championship, where they made it to the ACC championship. They lost that football game, and people were making the argument SMU shouldn't be in the playoff because they lost the ACC championship game. Well, the same argument now is presenting itself by way of the Alabama Crimson Tide. There's people out there saying, and I've seen both sides of the fence, and both sides of the fence make some convincing arguments as it pertains to if Alabama loses to Georgia this weekend in Atlanta, could it potentially knock Alabama out of the playoff? Now, you might be shocked to hear what I have to say about this. And my take on it is, when we look at these teams and we look at the way these teams are ranked and we look at where Alabama's at, we look at an Alabama team that is ranked 9th in the country. So they would have to fall, here's the scenario I think where it could put Alabama out of the playoff. Here's the scenario that I feel like Alabama doesn't make it. If Georgia beats Alabama in Atlanta and BYU beats Texas Tech, that is the scenario I feel like that will kick Alabama out of the playoff. If a BYU would have to play their best game of the season to beat Texas Tech, let's be honest, but if BYU were to beat Texas Tech, BYU currently sitting at 11th, obviously that would bump them up. Bama's loss would move them back, potentially putting Alabama outside and beyond the playoff cutoff line. That is the nightmare scenario for Alabama fans. So if you're an Alabama fan, you need to be rooting that you take care of business against Georgia and that Texas Tech takes care of business against BYU. Likewise, I think Alabama needs Texas Tech to win regardless. Even if Alabama loses in Atlanta, Texas Tech wins, I still feel like Alabama makes it by the skin of their teeth, even at 10-3, because we've seen this committee set the precedent last year with SMU that you make it to your conference championship, you lose that football game, you're not going to be as heavily punished for it as you would a loss in the regular season. So when we look at this and we analyze it, that's where I'm seeing it. I feel like now Alabama can't get blown out. That's another key. Alabama goes to Atlanta this weekend, say Georgia wins like 34-10 or something. Just throwing a number out there. If that happens, we have a whole nother discussion and Selection Sunday gets a lot more tense for Alabama fans. If you get blown out in Atlanta, regardless of the outcome of Texas Tech and BYU, if you get blown out in Atlanta, this committee might still look at that and say, I don't know. Do we put them in there? That's a big part. And I think if all else goes like I said, if Georgia wins in Atlanta, if Georgia wins a close one in Atlanta, Texas Tech wins over BYU in the Big 12 championship, I feel like Bama's in. I feel like if Georgia blows Bama out, Texas Tech wins, I think Bama's out. If Bama wins, they're in 100%. But I feel like that it can get a little murky with results of some football games, and those two football games in particular. And I think, Bama fans should be saying Roll Tide and whatever Texas Tech fans say. Guns up, whatever they do. I feel like that's who you need to be rooting for is both those teams, and obviously Alabama fans are going to be rooting for Alabama. But if you have a secondary team this weekend, need to be rooting for Texas Tech as well, because BYU winning could really throw a wrench in some things, especially if you lose that SEC championship against Georgia. So, jumping into a little bit, quick minute, talking about recruiting. Today was National Signing Day. Recording this on December 3rd. This will be released, like I said, I recorded the night before I released the episode. So today was National Signing Day. Certain surprises. Jared Curtis flipped over to Vanderbilt from Georgia, the number one player in the 2026 cycle, quarterback out of Nashville. Not really a surprise for a lot of people in the space. He was committed to Georgia, but I don't think this is a kid that wanted to come in, and you can't hate him for it. You see some Georgia fans attack a kid for not wanting to sign with Georgia, not wanting to play for Georgia. Like, well, if you don't want to win and you want to play for a mediocre school, just say so. In case you haven't noticed, Vanderbilt is not mediocre this year. So, local kid out of Nashville wants to be that hometown hero and doesn't want to be buried in the depth chart in Athens. Can't fault a kid for making that decision at all. Because if anything has told us, we've seen anything about Georgia's quarterback situation, it's that very rarely do Kirby Smart and Mike Bobo trust a true freshman quarterback under center in Athens. And Jared Curtis is a kid that's going to come in. He's going to have to learn the offense. If he were going to Georgia, he would have to come in. He would have to learn the offense, get acclimated, everything. I just don't see him starting day one. With the talent that Georgia's going to have, it's being said Gunnar Stockton's going to return. Then you have Puglisi there, Ryan Montgomery. You don't want to be third or fourth on the depth chart going into your first season. Kids, betting on himself essentially, doesn't want to sit and wait his turn. And the nature of the beast now, that's college football. A lot of these kids, they don't want to sit and wait. And I'm not going to fault him for making that decision for himself. He feels like he's going to get the playing time he deserves at Vanderbilt. Hats off to him. More power to him. But all in all, signing day, not a whole lot of crazy aside from that, not a whole lot of crazy flips, not a whole lot of crazy storylines coming off of signing day. Everything went pretty much as expected. USC's confirmed to have locked down the number one class for the 2026 cycle. So Lincoln Riley getting the job done there. The number one receiver in the class goes to Ohio State. Shocker there. And we, press on. So, Conference Championship weekend, a weekend that we look forward to, I think, all year long. We look at this, and this is the weekend where a lot of the playoff picture, obviously, the playoff picture will reveal itself on Sunday, on Selection Sunday, but these are, big games, highly anticipated, especially the Big Ten Championship where you have Ohio State and Indiana, two teams that haven't met in the regular season. Some people believe Indiana, kind of taking advantage of a little bit of a soft schedule. Same with Ohio State. Ohio State didn't play. They played a Texas to start the year, then kind of coasted through the season, played a Michigan team with a freshman quarterback. Just a lot worked in Ohio State's favor. And we're still kind of, I feel like Ohio State's good, don't get me wrong, but we'll keep seeing it as we progress into the postseason. And this is where we'll start, is in the Big Ten Championship game. Ohio State and Indiana, great quarterback matchup that we're going to see here with Julian Sand against Fernando Mendoza for Indiana. Two guys that are Heisman hopefuls. This is everything that you could expect from this championship game. All the storylines are still intact. Indiana didn't slip up down the stretch. Ohio State didn't slip up down the stretch. This is a game that I've been looking forward to seeing for about a month now, because we're really going to find out a lot about Indiana in this football game, and we're going to find out, I feel like, a lot about Ohio State and how these teams are postured going into the playoff. Both of these teams are playoff locks. There's no drama here. Indiana with a loss is still in the playoff. Ohio State with a loss is still in the playoff. So there's no drama here surrounding if one of them loses, is one out. No, both of these teams are 100% playoff locks as of right now. The way that this game, I feel like, is going to come down to, and we've seen an Indiana defense that exceeded a lot of people's expectations this year. They've been consistently throughout the season, they've been one of the top defense in the country in disruption metrics and disruption stats. You talk about a team that's top 10 in tackles for loss, top 10 in QB pressures. They get after the quarterback. They don't produce the sacks. Their sack rate is kind of middle of the road, mid-grade. I'd say really upper third of college football. But they disrupt. And a lot of times, if you know anything about football, you know that sack rate and sacks is kind of an overrated stat at sometimes. Yes, you want a defense to get to the quarterback, but if you can affect the quarterback, affect his timing, affect his rhythm, affect the offense, then it changes the game entirely. Julian Sand, one of the guys, snapped a pass. He's one of the fastest in the country, sub 3 seconds getting the football out. The only one that really rivals him, Ty Simpson. Now, Fernando Mendoza gets the ball out pretty quick as well, but Julian Sand, accurate 80% completion percentage this year. And when you got targets like Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate, it's really Brandon Ennis, also one guy that has really emerged this year later in the season as being kind of that, and he is a captain on that football team, but kind of has been a very good third option. It's crazy to say that your team captain is your third option on offense, but that's just how deep Ohio State is at the receiver position. The question here is going to be the trenches. Ohio State's offensive line versus Indiana's defensive line, and vice versa. I think that's where this game is going to be won or lost for either of these football teams. And Ohio State, to me, with the talent that they have, Julian Sand doesn't ever get touched. I can't tell you the last game that I watched of Ohio State where I saw grass stains on Julian Sand's jersey. Like, honestly, I don't even know if they've had to wash it. I know they have, obviously. The equipment team there at Ohio State doing the Lord's work, washing the jerseys and cleaning everything up. I think Julian Sands made their jobs pretty easy over the course of this football season. He doesn't get touched. That's credit to Ohio State's offensive line, one of the top units in the country in a lot of those key O-line metrics and statistics. That, to me, is going to be matchup that I'm going to be circling the most. And I know we could talk about Indiana's secondary holding up against Tate, Smith, Ennis, and this, and also Indiana's, stopping the run against Bo Jackson as well. And a lot of times, these Big Ten championship games that we see, Big Ten, big boy football, rivals the SEC in the regard that physicality is of a premium in that league, and you can say what you want about it, but that's the way that the Big Ten chooses to play football. Indiana with their high-flying offense, Ohio State, both of these teams very statistically just dominating teams on the offensive side of the ball, putting up a lot of points. Point spreads have been crazy between the teams that they've played. And all in all, though, this championship game is going to come down to talent level, and it's going to come down to the pace at which these teams want to play. These teams are very similarly built, whereas, they want to run the football. Indiana with Black wants to run the football. Jackson on the other side for Ohio State, they want to run the football. But at the same time, they have the weapons. Indiana with Surratt and Cooper. They can get downfield and stretch you vertically as well. So Ohio State's secondary also going to be a key there. Indiana's secondary going to be a key against Ohio State's weapons. When I've watched these two teams play, though, I feel when I go to predict this game, when I look at these teams, I look at an Ohio State team that is playing just very dominant football right now. I look at a team that for weeks now we've heard, is there a gap between these two teams? Is there separation between Indiana and Ohio State at 1 and 2? Clearly, the FPI and Vegas is very torn on this. A lot of money has been coming in on Indiana late. Ohio State opened up a little bit heavier as a favorite, now only a 5.5-point favorite. FPI gives Ohio State a 49.4% chance to win this football game. Indiana at 50.6. Regardless of if you follow the FPI or not, I have found that sometimes, especially in these coin flip style games, FPI is a very misleading metric to follow when it comes to picking these games. I would not advise putting money on these football games based on the FPI. And my hot take on this football game, and I've said it privately to some people when I've talked to them about it, I'm going to say it publicly now on the show. I think Ohio State wins this game by 2 scores. I really don't. When I look at Indiana, I see a really good football team. I don't see a team. I see a team that's very finesse driven. I see a team that has to rely on Surratt, Cooper to get downfield, make the big plays. We saw this team against Penn State without one of their weapons, without Surratt. We saw this team struggle offensively against Penn State and the level of physicality that Penn State was bringing their way. And if you think Penn State was physical, Ohio State is worlds more physical than Penn State. You've got guys like Arville Reese. You've got Caleb Downs, who's a great run-fitter safety who also plays very well on the back end. These guys are very physical up front. They're built big. They're fast. They're twitchy. I feel like I said, that's the difference in the football game is the level of physicality. The talent level, to me, sways heavily towards Ohio State, especially when you look at defense versus offense. I've got Ohio State winning this football game, and like I said, I think Ohio State wins this game by 2 scores. I'm looking at something along the lines of 31. I'll say 31-20 in this football game. I'd say 31-20, an 11-point win for Ohio State. I'm going to take Ohio State to cover in this one. I can't get behind Indiana in this spot. I think Ohio State is by far the best team in the country. Is there a gap between them and everybody? I don't know. I think there's some teams out there that can give Ohio State a tough football game. I just don't think that they're going to be denied in the Big Ten championship game against Indiana. So moving on to game I mentioned a few minutes ago as well, the Big 12 championship. We have BYU Texas Tech, a rematch of a game in which Texas Tech won earlier in the football season. Texas Tech won 29-7. So an embarrassing performance from BYU in that football game. When you go back and look at the stats of that football game, you look at a BYU team that ran the ball 27 times for 67 yards, turned the football over 3 times. That can't happen again if you want a chance. Likewise, I think it's a feat in of itself. BYU was able to hold Texas Tech to 29 points in their first matchup. I feel like that was a game that could have got more out of hand. Texas Tech just didn't capitalize on a couple extra opportunities that they had given to them by BYU, in the sense that they, fumbled the ball twice and threw 1 interception. BYU, to me, a little bit too one-dimensional on offense. This is an offense that goes as Bear Bachmeier goes. And Texas Tech did a really good job of containing him in their last matchup. I don't see how this is going to be any different in this contest. This is a game, when we look at it, Texas Tech favored in this football game by 12.5 points. A lot of money coming in on Texas Tech. And when you see the results of the last matchup, it's hard to think that this result of this football game is going to be any different. Baron Morton throwing the rock, with Texas Tech spending all the money on their roster that they did. That defense, which has been top 10 in the country in a lot of key areas and metrics all season long. I don't really see a different outcome. I see BYU putting up a little bit more fight than they did last time. I'm still looking at a Texas Tech win I'm still looking at a 30-16, 30-17 win Texas Tech. I'm looking at Texas Tech to cover in this one. I don't think that BYU, I don't think second time's a charm here. I don't think that's not a saying. That there's a reason nobody says that. I don't see them being able to flip the script in this second matchup against Texas Tech, unless Texas Tech comes out and just is flat, turns the ball over, gives BYU a lot of extra opportunities. I just don't see this game ending any different. And, I've got Texas Tech winning this one. I've got Texas Tech winning it 30-17, covering the 12.5 point spread. Feel like with ease, I feel like they'll be in firm control of that football game from the jump. So the game of the week for After the Whistle, and I say that with every ounce of sarcasm that I can muster there. The game of the week is Duke and Virginia in the ACC Championship. I mean, what a joke. What a joke of a conference this year. I mean, this was a conference that we thought earlier in the season, before the season started really, everybody was really high on Clemson. Florida State beats Alabama, and everybody's like, whoa, okay. Miami looks really good. We thought this might come down to the wire, come down to the last weekend of the season. This might be a 3-horse race between those 3 football teams. And it's like I said, I think it was last week's episode, maybe the week before. If you would have told me after the first week of the season, or maybe even before the season, that the ACC Championship in Charlotte at the end of the season was not going to feature one of those 3 teams, I would have laughed at you. If you'd have told me that 2 of those 3 teams were going to not be there, I probably still would have laughed at you, because I felt like the matchup was going to be either Miami, Florida State, Clemson, whatever, combination you want to put on that football game. I felt like that's what we were going to see. And, we see the season play out. We see Florida State lose, a lot of games. We see Miami falter there in the middle of the football season against Louisville and SMU. And we also see a Clemson team that just couldn't really get off the runway, losing in the opening weekend against LSU, and then just continuing to just falter down the stretch. Even in the start of the season, they picked it up there on the back half. Clemson looked a lot better on the back half of the season. But, here we are, Duke and Virginia. And the nightmare scenario here is, and I've seen a lot of people. I saw a graphic, I think it was last night or the night before, that said a 7-5 Duke team could get into the playoff as the ACC champ. The rules have changed, people. I need y'all to understand something. Just because you win the conference doesn't mean that you are going to be in the playoff. It is the highest ranked conference champions. If Duke wins the ACC championship, they are an unranked conference champion. So you will have the Big Ten champion. You'll have the Big 12 champion. Either of those will be ranked. You'll have the SEC champion. Either of those will be ranked. Tulane and North Texas are both ranked 24 and 20. James Madison is ranked at 25th. There is an opportunity for 2 Group of 5 teams to be in this playoff if Duke beats Virginia for the ACC championship. Now, if Virginia wins, there we go. But the Armageddon-style scenario that awaits us is Duke winning the ACC championship and the ACC not getting a single team in the playoff. Will it happen? It would be the most Duke thing ever for them to win this football game. You know, we've seen a team this year very wishy-washy. Manny Diaz's outfit there been very, at times, they've looked solid. At times, terrible. 5 times to be exact this year. They've looked terrible. I just don't see it happening. Virginia favored by 2.5. A lot of money on Duke in this one to pull the upset. I'm really a fan of chaos. I would love the drama that would be around this football game if Duke were to win. The drama around the playoff if Duke were to win. I don't see it happening. I see Virginia playing their style of football, getting physical, bleeding the clock a little bit, running the football. And I'm kind of thinking this game might be I think it might be a slugfest. I really don't think Virginia's going to run away with it. Now, could they? Absolutely. Virginia could go in here and just mop the floor with Duke, win 34-10, move on. But I think this game might be a little bit more of a back and forth kind of rock fight style football game than a lot of people are thinking. I'm going to go Virginia in this one, but I'm going to go Virginia by a touchdown. I'm going to call Virginia 27, Duke 20 for the ACC championship, avoiding the nightmare scenario of the ACC not getting a playoff team or not having a playoff team, avoiding the nightmare scenario there. So, moving on. Just mentioned the 2 Group of 5 conference championship games. I'm not going to really talk about the Sun Belt Conference Championship game that much. James Madison, to me, worlds better than Troy. It would absolutely shock me to my core if Troy beats James Madison. Just a James Madison team that is just talent level is above Troy. Don't think there's anything Troy can do in that regard. I'm going to take James Madison. I'm going to take the points in that football game. James Madison currently is a 21.5-point favorite. I really could see James Madison just turning that game into a bloodbath and winning by 30 points. I really could. So not going to talk about that one too much. North Texas and Tulane in the American Athletic Championship. Tulane, John Summerall, going to be on the sideline coaching Tulane per his agreement with Florida and Tulane to remain the coach to see this thing through. I think North Texas also. You know, their coach is gone as well. So we will see we'll see a Tulane win in this one. I feel like John Summerall being on the sideline, the difference maker, I feel like I would lean heavily more towards North Texas if, you know, I would lean more towards North Texas if Summerall wasn't on the sideline. North Texas currently favored by 3. I like for Tulane to win outright. I like John Summerall. I feel like it was a great hire for Florida, regardless of what a lot of Florida fans are saying online about him being Napier 2.0. I like Summerall. I like this Tulane team. I think that they get it done in the American Athletic Championship, and I think they get a playoff berth out of it. So moving on, the real game of the week, the real game of the week here, not the one that I just mentioned a few minutes ago with Duke and Virginia. Sarcastically, I have to reiterate that point. is going to be Georgia and Alabama. And I know people are tired of seeing this matchup. But here's the thing. These are the best two teams in the Southeastern Conference. You know, regardless of what you think about Alabama, the loss to FSU, yes, I know it's a bad loss. But Alabama has proven, and Georgia has proven, to be the consistent force in this conference. You know, we saw an A&M team that lost to a Texas team there to finish the season. A&M kind of feasted on the lower half of the SEC this year. We didn't really know how good they were. They ran into a physical test in Texas, got beat by 10 points. These are the best two teams in the SEC. This is the one time where I feel like, or not the one time, but this is an example of everything playing out how it should. And these are, you know, two teams that want it. Alabama, a lot of people saying Alabama with a loss here could be knocked out of the playoff. I don't think that's the case unless the scenario that I mentioned at the start of today's show occurs and BYU beats Texas Tech and Georgia beats Alabama. I feel like that's really the only time where we could see Alabama miss the playoff this year in a loss. I wouldn't say they're a lock because you never know with this committee. This committee's been throwing us some curveballs this year, recently. So I wouldn't count on it, Alabama fans. Even if you lose this football game and Texas Tech wins the Big 12, I wouldn't count on the committee keeping you in there. Although I think you should still be in there. I don't think that I would not. It's just like when you have a boxing match, MMA fight, whatever. You never want to let it go to a decision. Knock your opponent out, leave no doubt, be done with it. Now, Georgia and Alabama meet again. They met earlier in the season. Georgia's only blemish on their record is to this Alabama team, losing in Athens 24-21. Is this a revenge spot for Georgia? I feel like as we've watched these teams throughout the year, I feel like Alabama through that stretch where they beat four straight ranked opponents, I feel like that's when Alabama was playing their best football. Here recently, Alabama hasn't been playing their best football. I feel like we've seen a Georgia team that has progressed and gotten better throughout the season. Defense has gotten more mature, making better decisions, not as many holes in that secondary as there was earlier in the season. Ellis Robinson playing great. The emergence of DeMello Jones on that side as well. I feel like this is a secondary that really got carved up. You know, Alabama, Kalen DeBoer, Ty Simpson, you know, this offense had Georgia in a spin cycle. You know, Ryan Grubb's offense just had Georgia defenders not having any idea what was going on in that first matchup. That was early in the season. I feel like this team's matured. I feel like Georgia's matured a lot. Alabama's kind of been in coast mode. You know, they've had a few close calls, one with Auburn. You know, they've had a few close calls down the stretch. The loss to Oklahoma was big for them. But I still haven't seen anything out of Alabama over the last month that leads me to believe that they've gotten better. They've still just kind of been relying on the fact that their talent is better than everybody they've played, aside from in the Oklahoma game where they got beat. They've had to kind of lean heavily on just our dudes are better than your dudes. And this is a scenario where Alabama's going to be lining up against a team that matches them, and you could also make the argument that is better than them talent-wise. You know, I'm not saying that's a definite, but they're definitely it's like pick on somebody your own size. Well, these teams can look each other in the eyeball. You know, same height, same weight, everything, same weight class, you name it. Now, there is also the mental factor that we've yet to mention that people have been mentioning over the last week, talking about this game in the lead up to it. And that is the fact that the mental edge that people feel like Alabama has over Georgia. And I'm not going to argue. I am a Georgia fan. Everybody knows that. I don't hide my loyalties. You know, you can call me a homer, call me whatever you want. But this Georgia team seems like they can play their best football against everybody else in the country. They will look like world beaters against everybody. And when they see those guys in crimson line up across from them, it's like they forget what's going on. They forget how to play football. They don't play their best. They make mistakes that they don't normally make. So there is also the mental aspect of that. Now, Alabama with the talent, the question remains, the run game still is a big, big, big area of concern for this Alabama football team. Alabama outside of the top 100 in the country in rushing yards a game, yards per rush, you name it. A lot of key rushing statistics, metrics, Alabama's outside the top 100 in the country. That has not happened in 2 decades for this Alabama football team. Not when Nick Saban was the coach. Have they ever finished that low running the football in the country outside of the top 100? I think Nick Saban, I was doing some digging the other day, I think Nick Saban, the worst rushing attack that he had as coach of the Alabama Crimson Tide, ranked 47th in the country. That was a bad year for him. I mean, not a bad year. I think they still went on to win 10 or 11 games that year, but it was still not his standard running the football. And this is an Alabama team where we saw, last week, we saw, Jam Miller get a little banged up. So the question mark is he going to be healthy and ready to go? We don't, we don't know. We will see when the injury report is released later in the week, who's available, who's probable, who's questionable, and all of that. We'll see that. But Jam Miller not being 100% is an area of concern, especially for a struggling Alabama rushing attack against a Georgia defense that is historically, since Kirby Smart took over in Athens, very good at stopping the run and making you one-dimensional. Now, it didn't matter much, when you look at the rushing stats for the first meeting between these two football teams, and you look at what Alabama did in that football game, they ran for 117 yards on 38 carries. So they eclipsed the 100-yard mark. It's one of the only times this season that they've done it, but they eclipsed the 100-yard mark on 38 carries. Now, they had to earn every single yard, 3.1 yards a carry. You got to earn it. But I see this being an area of concern in the regard that I feel like this Georgia secondary has gotten better as the years gone on. I don't think the holes will be there for Ty Simpson, Ryan Williams, Jeremy Bernard, and all those weapons that Ty Simpson has at his disposal. I'm not seeing the holes there that were there earlier in the season. I think this is going to be a game where Alabama is going to have to play near perfect to win. Now, there is the mental edge to take into account that people seem to think Alabama has over Georgia, and the argument has a lot of merit when you think about that. But I feel like Georgia's going to win a close one here in Atlanta, win the SEC. I feel like the score could be very similar to the way it was last time. 24-21, 27-24, 26-23, somewhere in that neighborhood. I like Georgia in this spot. Georgia currently the 2.5-point favorite. I like them to cover, win by a field goal, and move on into the playoff, get that first round bye. I feel like if the game's close like that, 3-point win for Georgia, I feel like Alabama essentially will make it into the playoff. I don't see the committee dropping them and penalizing them for losing the conference championship game if they lose it by a field goal. Now, like I said before, Georgia comes in here, plays their A-plus game. Bama shows up with their C game, which historically is not really a thing Bama does very often. But Bama comes in here with their C game, Georgia with their A-plus. Georgia wins by 20-plus points. Like I said, highly unlikely. But if it happens, that opens up the opportunity for the committee to think about it and go, you know what? I don't think that we're going to put Bama in there because of that, the margin that they lost by in the SEC championship. Likewise, though, I think it's going to be a really good game. I think it's going to be a very physical game. Georgia really banged up. Some injuries. Drew Bobo, the center, lower leg injury that he got against Georgia Tech. He also had the injury to his hand, so pretty banged up there. A couple more key players that are playing through injury. But it's like Kirby Smart said, if you're scared of injuries, you're going to get a scared team. And both of these teams have their fair share of injuries. Like I mentioned already before, Jam Miller for Alabama banged up. Bama has a couple guys on defense banged up as well. So this is going to be a game that's going to come down to the mentality of who wants it more, who wants to hoist that SEC championship trophy more. Alabama with their backs against the wall. You make the argument their backs against the wall with them potentially losing a playoff spot. And, I won't go over that again because I've already mentioned it multiple times. But I like Georgia in this spot by a field goal. So championship weekend's one of my favorite weekends, y'all. I love it. By far just, great football across the board. I feel like we're going to see some really good matchups between Ohio State, Indiana, Bama, Georgia, Texas Tech, BYU. I think might be a blowout. But other than that, great weekend of football to sit around, hang out, and enjoy it with family, friends, whatever else. Speaking of family and friends, be sure to tell your family and friends about this podcast. I released a metric or some statistics on Spotify Wrapped, because this podcast is distributed through Spotify, even though you can consume this podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon. It's distributed through Spotify, so I get my Spotify Wrapped summary for 2025 for this show. And I am just a little pat on the back moment for me to talk about and shout out my listeners, my dedicated listeners, the people that listen to me every episode, the people that tell their friends and their family about the show. I'm seeing the listener count grow. I know that's because of y'all. I can't thank y'all enough for that. The audience that this show has reached this year, as opposed to 2024, has grown 166%. So big claps for y'all on that one. Give y'all a round of applause on that one. Followers on Spotify. Now, this doesn't count YouTube followers. This doesn't count Apple Podcast or Amazon. But followers on Spotify, we're up 66%. That's because of y'all. So another clap for y'all on that one as well. Also, listening time. The total number of hours that this show's been listening to from last year to this year is up over 20%. So another round of applause there for my great listeners. And thank y'all for getting the word out. Thank you for continuing to listen to the show. It means a lot to me. I appreciate you more than you know. Enjoy the football this weekend, and I will catch y'all on Sunday night, thinking about doing a little bit of a Facebook Live as the rankings are revealed on Selection Sunday. I'll keep y'all updated on social media as to if that is going to be a possibility and if we're going to be able to make that happen. So y'all have a great weekend. Enjoy the football. I will catch y'all on the next episode of After the Whistle. See y'all.